That's my fourth favorite meal of the day. All right, we are going to have, before we begin our 2:15 session, a very quick visit to stage to discuss the podcast Accelerator program, which you may be familiar with if this is not your first Werk It. I'm going to ask you to help me welcome Paula Schumann, who's the VP of New Show Development at WNYC, to explain the program and to announce this year's winner. Please help me welcome Paula.
I feel like I'm on the Great British Baking Show, but I don't know if I'm the one who has the good news or the bad news. So I oversee new show development at WNYC Studios. WNYC Studios puts on Werk It. Werk It is supported in part by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. And as part of their support, they decided, and they did this last year and doing it again this year, to support the accelerating of one person's idea to provide up to $10,000 worth of piloting support with WNYC Studios. And we opened that call to anyone who was participating in Werk It who wanted to submit their idea and have a chance to win a pilot supported by CPB. And we got a lot of submissions. And a group of us got together and poured through these submissions a few weeks ago. It was myself, Irva Gunja, who also works at WNYC Studios, Rebecca Ibarra, who is one of our producers at WNYC, Kathy Tu, who is the co-host of Nancy. Kathy was the winner of our first podcast, Accelerator, which I think was in 2015, before Werk It was the thing, or maybe it was 2014. And went on to make Nancy, which is an incredibly successful show out of that. And Rebecca Ibarra actually produced last year's Accelerator winner, who was Destry Silby. So, I just heard something. So this year we have another winner, and it's really exciting. And I just want to say, before we announce the winner, we narrowed it down to 8 finalists. We met with them one-on-one yesterday to hear their pitches in person and to interrogate them. I have to say, I was very impressed with their ability to get up there and do it. It was very hard. We had a timer set. I was like, 7 minutes left, 5 minutes, asking a lot of hard questions. And all of the ideas were really, really impressive. And all of the women who pitched were really impressive. And we had a very hard time making a decision. Everybody just, whatever question we flung at them, they had an answer to. They knew their stuff really well. They sort of understood how to grab an audience, which was also really important. So we spent about 3 hours after that debating and discussing and following up with some people. And in the end, we did pick one winner. I will also say that after this, I plan on sending notes to all the people who didn't win, just to give you some more feedback and more context, and so you have our information if you want to follow up with us, because again, we were enamored of all of you and really impressed. So the winner that we chose, and you can come up when I say your name, this is so weird, is Rachel Gorlin. Okay. Are you getting a microphone? Oh, so there's a trophy for you. It's worth $10,000. Good luck. No. So let me just say one word. Don't go anywhere. So you can take a photo. So Rachel's idea was called To Catch a Senator. And come over here. Just like, on the stage. Okay. So Rachel's idea is called To Catch a Senator. And I'm going to just say briefly what we were interested about. It's looking back at the story of Senator Bob Packwood, who, and you might correct me if I'm wrong, was the first senator to be expelled since the Civil War.
The Senate Ethics Committee voted to expel him. He resigned. He saw the writing on the wall. Okay. So.
See, this is, again, what we were impressed with, the fact-checking. And the last one since to be...
Absolutely. Yeah, expulsion is a huge deal.
It's a big deal. So this was in 1992. This was after Anita Hill, but before Monica Lewinsky. And many of us felt like this period in history has been kind of forgotten. And the more we heard about it from Rachel, the more like sort of, what? what the fuck? What happened? We were. And the more we felt like this could be a really good story. And Rachel was there at the time. She was involved in Bob Packwood's opponent's campaign. She's teamed up with a columnist, a writer at the Oregonian. Packwood represented a district and represented Oregon. And the story is, in some ways, on the surface, a sort of Me Too story. Packwood assaulted many women over the course of his life as a senator, and who knows, probably for many years before that. But it also looks at sort of how the media treated these things back in 1992 in such a different way than it does now. A lot of people knew about this, but weren't willing to actually go out and report on it. It also looks at the sort of history of our democracy and how the Senate actually functioned at that point. Interestingly enough, the person in charge of the ethics committee at the time was Mitch McConnell, who was a proud defender of women's rights to not be assaulted. Senator Barbara Boxer was leading the charge. There was a reporter who broke the story, Florence Graves. So there's a lot of people who are still around to talk about this, and I think it felt like a really urgent story, and Rachel felt like the person who could be telling it. And the combination of those two things really excited us. So I'll stop talking. Rachel, do you want to add anything about your project?
No, except that I'm incredibly excited and incredibly grateful. Thank you. And I know there was stiff competition, and I just want to give a shout out to all my 7 cohorts. And I know your projects are great, and you're going to make them.
Agreed. Okay, thanks, Rachel. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, everyone at Werk.
Congratulations. Thank you, Paula. All right, it's 2:16 and a half. Now we are heading into a session called Beyond Underwear and Mattresses, scaling a multi-million-dollar podcasting business. All right, but before we start, can I get one more round of applause for the winner? Yes. Okay, I'm now going to ask you to help me. Welcome. Caila Litman and Katie Sprenger, both of them are here representing the Vox Media Podcast Network, and they're going to tell you a little bit about what they do and how they do it.
Are you ready to go beyond underwear and mattresses? Ooh.
Yay.
Okay, I think this is my clicker. Is this my clicker? Okay, got my clicker. That's what's important. So
This is a big stage.
yeah, we're super excited. Okay, so pressing the button. There we go. Okay,
us.
we did it. So my name is Caila Litman. I work at the Vox Media Podcast Network. If you're unfamiliar, we have a ton of podcasts. We're about 200 podcasts right now. And that includes Vox.com, Recode, The Verge, Eater, Curbed, Polygon. Is there anything I'm missing, Katie?
There's a lot, yeah.
Yeah, and then
some new stuff
New
that's coming
stuff.
up.
It rhymes with Schmoomork Mag.
Yeah.
We'll see what that looks like. And I head up audio revenue operations, which I think might be a fancy word for doing things that other people don't want to do when it comes to ad sales.
And I am the supervising producer of branded audio, so I lead the production team that creates all of the ads across all of our networks, so host reads, produced reads, branded segments, etc.
Yes, and Katie is prolific. It's only October, and she's already produced more than 500 audio assets when it comes to advertising.
It feels like a lot more than that.
Pretty big deal. So that's who we are, and you know what? Maybe you've noticed, but there's been a lot of buzz about where the podcast advertising space is going. Has anyone noticed that? Anybody?
I've
Okay.
noticed that.
So according to a PwC study done in conjunction with the IAB, they are projecting that by 2021, we're going to hit $1 billion in podcast ad revenue.
So while you're letting that sink in, $1 billion in, was that 2 years from now?
Yeah.
We thought it would be interesting to sort of quantify this rapid growth, because we're all sort of living on this podcast rocket. You guys know how it feels just as much as we do. So we wanted to take a look at some numbers so that we can really put like some numbers behind how quickly we've grown. So the first one I want to talk about is in 2005, there were about 3,000 podcasts on Apple Podcasts. We found a press release that said so it's true. Now, now it's 2019, there are 700,000 plus podcasts in the world. And so that is 15-ish years and a 23,000% increase in content.
Pretty crazy. I wonder where that's all coming from. Oh, I don't know. Everyone sitting in this room who's making amazing podcasts. Let's see you guys out there.
Oh, mic check. Oh, that's good. Okay, thank you. And so while content has absolutely exploded, so too has the audience. So according to the most recent the Edison Research Infinite Dial survey, in 2009, about 11% of people 12 plus in the United States, that's usually how you measure people, 12 plus, listen to a podcast every month. 2019, that number is 32%, which is a 190% increase in 10 years, in audience, monthly audience.
Which is insane. We were doing this math, and I literally had to phone a friend.
Your dad.
The friend was my dad. But I was like, is this number correct?
Yeah, I found like an online tool where you can just like put in the first number and the second number, and then it tells you what the percent change is, because we really didn't actually trust it.
It has to be, that's too high, but that's a huge growth in just such a short period of time. And then the final number that is most interesting about the growth story is how much money we're making in advertising revenue. And no one really cared up until recently because it wasn't a big business. It was sort of a cottage industry. And we found a number from 2015 that indicated that it was about a $100 million business at that point, which maybe coincidentally is the size of Casper Mattresses revenue just from a few years ago.
There are no coincidences.
Yeah, no coincidences. And so now in 2019, they're projecting that it's going to be over $600 million in podcast ad revenue. And that is about a 540% increase in ad revenue in just 4 years. Pretty crazy.
Yeah, it's absolutely bananas. And so while you sit there and you let that sink in, that 540% increase in 4 years and some change, it really makes you wonder, how do we scale? That's the question we're asking, right?
Yep, and if we're gonna make it rain money in this industry, we have to look at it through two critical lenses.
That's right, and we also have to consider our key constituencies, right? So we've got listeners, totally key, advertisers, and then we also have you guys, we have the creators. And all of those three have sort of competing interests and goals, and they have to be working in tandem for this thing to actually scale properly. And we don't mean necessarily just making $1 billion. What we mean is making $1 billion while serving listeners, while serving the creators, and while serving the advertisers.
So this is how we're gonna do it. This is our point of view here. We think that in order to do it, we need to look at the data. First, how are we gonna have enough data to make it enticing and interesting for advertisers to continue to flow into the space? And then also the advertising creative, which is Katie's wheelhouse over here. So we're gonna talk through those two lenses and share with you what our point of view is based on what we understand the industry to be moving in.
Yep. So first, the data. This is a very interesting thing. In the beginning, we had the download. Caila, what does a download tell us?
Oh, I don't know, Katie. A whole lot of nothing.
Yeah.
It really doesn't tell us very much.
Right.
It really just says that, someone tried to access your podcast.
So what doesn't a download tell us?
Ooh, I don't know who listened to it, where they're from, what they're interested in, what they like to eat, and pretty much anything about them. Or if they
actually heard the damn podcast, if they listened to the ads, if they did anything after listening to the ads, we don't know very much.
We really don't. And also, up until recently, the download data wasn't universally the same. So there's this thing called a measurement window. Does anyone have heard the term? So measurement windows are the a period of time in which a download is counted. So there's 5 minutes, an hour, and 24 hours. And so the IAB, which is the...
I wrote it down, Interactive Advertising Bureau.
So they're basically like the Ministry of Magic for advertising. So they decided that, okay, in order to clean up the data and to ensure that everyone's measuring their downloads the same way, we're gonna need to make this a standardized measurement window, which caused about a 30% haircut across the board in what download numbers a lot of podcasts were seeing.
And just to let you know, the current IAB standard is a 24-hour download window, which means one person from one IP address, I think, downloaded the podcast and listened in a 24-hour window. So at this time, Caila, what else wasn't there?
Oh, you know, we really didn't have ad tech. We didn't have sales agencies or specialists who really knew how to sell podcast advertising. It was a lot of folks who were coming over from radio, and it really wasn't apples to apples. And then we also didn't have content networks the way that we do today 10 years ago. It wasn't a collective of people who were saying, hey, you can come to us and we know how to serve your ads across a bunch of different shows.
Exactly. But then we hit a couple of really important inflection points. And the first one we want to talk about is 2009, 2010. So at this point, there's a couple of thousand podcasts out there, and they start sort of like collecting into networks. So you had Earwolf and Feral and things like that all coming together. And then you also had a couple of really big major podcasts that were getting monster download numbers, and additionally, they were getting a ton of just like media buzz. And then because of that, you get an audience. The audience starts to build, and people start to realize that this is not just an audience, it is an audience that is committed and passionate and they want to support the people who were like talking to them through their earphones.
And that's when the direct response advertisers started to take notice. And this is very similar to the growth of the television networks. As soon as direct-to-consumer products say, hey, maybe we can reach the types of folks that were trying to buy our products through this channel, then it's setting the groundwork for other big brands to start spending money.
They were the canary in the coal mine.
Exactly. And so some of the early advertisers that you're probably familiar with are Squarespace, which entered in 2009, and then MeUndies, which followed suit in 2010, and really started to test out podcasts as a place to share their message and acquire audiences. Interestingly, MeUndies, as of last year, I believe it was a Bloomberg article, reported that 50% of their revenue comes from podcast ads.
It's completely insane.
What? Okay, so this is my favorite part.
Audience participation.
Quiz the audience. So what do you think the year that is the next critical inflection point for the podcast business? Anyone?
Anybody, shout it out.
2014! And why is 2014 a big deal?
Yay!
Serial!
Oh, you guys
Yay!
must be podcasters.
Yes. So in 2014, Serial came in, and at the time, like, MailChimp didn't know how well Serial was going to do. They were like, okay, this guy Ira Glass says it's gonna be cool. I'll sign up. I'll put my ad on this show.
Just this guy.
Yeah, just some guy. And so, it really proved out the point that a brand advertiser could reach millions of people through podcasts as a channel.
And that wasn't the only thing that happened in 2014. Radiotopia and Gimlet both launched in 2014, and then this is when you start to see this audience just grow and grow and grow and grow. So this is another, what are they called again?
Kind of a signal.
Graph.
Yeah,
graph.
a graph.
Thank you.
It's a graph.
This is a graph also from the Edison Infinite Dial poll. And what you see there, you can see, I mean, I'm looking at it here, you guys are looking at it there. But it's sort of flat. And then you hit 2014, and it does what our boss likes to call the
up and to the right dance.
The up and to the right dance.
I hate to bring a man into the conversation, but he's right. It is doing that dance.
Yep, and it's just going to keep going.
Yep, and so then we found ourselves today. Oh, excuse me. One quick thing I want to do before we get to our next inflection point. So I don't know who here works in the advertising environment, but I feel like it's just important to recognize the different buckets of advertisers. First, we have the direct response advertisers, which I just mentioned. Those are your Squarespaces, your Stitch Fixes, your Everlanes of the world, and they have different goals than maybe the brand advertiser does. And direct response advertisers still make up about 70% of the ads within the podcast market. And what they're looking for is people to immediately do something as soon as they hear an ad. And they're measuring based on conversions and based on acquisition, and that's what's important to them. Whereas brand advertisers have a different set of goals, Katie. What they're trying to do is maintain their dominance as the household name, makes you want to think of McDonald's or Audi. Like, sure, it would be great if someone heard a podcast ad and immediately hopped online and ordered a $100,000 car.
www.audi/pivot.
Yes, exactly. That
Go get
they
your
would
car
love
today.
that.
25%
but
off.
Their goal in mind is not that as much as just continuing to maintain awareness,
Yeah.
but within digital advertising, they have a ton of data at their disposal, and they're not about to jump full in to podcasts unless they know that data is available.
Okay, and so what kind of data do they need to feel comfortable here?
So they really need to know like who's listening, when they're listening, did they complete the ad, can they confirm that an impression was actually delivered, and we really didn't have that up until recently.
So we're behind. Is behind the 8 ball, is that when you're behind things? I don't remember what that one means.
That's a cool term.
Yeah, sure.
That works. We'll take it. Okay.
So we're behind, but we are in another inflection point right now, or at least we think that we do. And so this next section it's gonna be a little dense. I'm not gonna lie to you. It's a bit dense, but we think that we're in another inflection point, and we're gonna explain why.
Yes, so the reason we think we're in another inflection point is there's been a lot of game changers in just the past 18 months. And they are a whole boatload. So
Right.
hang on to your
All
hats,
of this.
people. This is gonna be a name-droppy slide, but
Yep.
we're here to share the knowledge.
So I think the first big game changer is ad tech, advertising technology. We saw in the last couple of years the sort of like wider adoption of dynamic audio insertion, dynamic advertising insertion.
And raise your hand if you know what dynamic ad insertion is.
Okay, cool.
Okay.
We've got a couple. I'll just sort of say it briefly. Basically, what it means is you can digitally insert an advertisement into a podcast in real time instead of serving it as part of the audio file in your RSS feed, right? So there's that. There's also just like a ton of new infrastructure that just sort of like undergirds our industry. That's good. And then also we have metrics and we have data now. We have a lot that are coming from the hosting platforms that we all use, like Art19 and Libsyn and Megaphone and all of these places. And additionally, we have, of course, Apple Podcasts, and that definitely, like, understanding what your audience is doing at any given time is, like, deeply important for all of us.
And that's recent. So Apple just recently opened up a little bit more information about what these audiences look like.
Right.
And so what these platforms have done is really given us a glimpse into who and where and when someone is listening to not only a podcast, but also that ad placement in the podcast.
That information that those brand advertisers want.
And so then we also have agency specialists that have entered the game, and they've really set a blueprint and the groundwork that is necessary for brand advertisers who might have more money to spend in the space to come in because it's been set up for them. And some of those agencies that are the most dominant within the space include Oxford Road, Ad Results, and Veritone, and they have some of the biggest spenders in the space, like ZipRecruiter, who spends the most in podcast advertising to date. And so they've set it up in such a way that it makes it easier for them to plug into this media channel, whereas 10 years ago, that didn't exist.
No.
And then I would also like to say that there are folks who are currently kind of turning that up on its head with like Right Side Up, which is more of a consultancy firm that takes somebody and embeds that into a Stitch Fix or a Roman's office, and they help develop what the podcast strategy is while being embedded with that client. And so it's just a different way of doing things. And then there's the programmatic marketplaces. So programmatic marketplaces are the way 70% of digital ad buying is happening. So a lot of the questions that we field from a day-to-day is how can I buy audio programmatically? And there's a lot of things that are different about that. It's not just plug and play. As you know, there's a lot of production that happens when you're dealing with a human voice, and it's not just like a banner ad somewhere. And so some of the programmatic marketplaces that are making it more plug and play, where an advertiser could buy into an audience or a contextual alignment of shows, are Art19, which is developing a marketplace, MTM through Megaphone, and also AdSwiz. So some of this stuff has really come to the fore within the past 9 months that never existed prior to this point.
Yeah, and if you needed more evidence, and I'm sure you guys did, if you needed
want
more
more?
evidence,
Want more information? Okay.
that we're in another inflection point is Pandora and Spotify and other distribution platforms getting into the game in really major ways with technology acquisitions, content acquisitions, et cetera. And I think the big takeaway for me is Pandora has what they call the power of the logged in user. And so what that means is that they know every single thing about the people who log in and use their platform. And that is extraordinarily valuable for advertisers, but it's also extraordinarily valuable for a platform itself who can then build content that they know an audience is going to enjoy.
And then finally, I want to highlight, and I promise this is the final thing on this slide. We're almost there. So brand study partners have also developed out ways that they could measure the efficacy of ads. And this is a big deal because they can do it for a lot of other ways of advertising, but for podcasts, because it's so new, they hadn't developed the methodology yet. But newcomers like Podsights and also Barometric and Chartable have been able to come in and build out the methodology for seeing how well your ad performed. And that's been mission critical for big advertisers to say, okay, yes, we can say yes to your advertising plan because we know we can measure it. And that's the difference between today and even like 8 months ago.
Well, and I will say too that while other inflection points were about content, I think, this one is very much about data and technology.
So some pretty exciting stuff happening here.
It's exciting, right? So in other words, we're getting there, but this really does bring us to the advertising creative, because if we're gonna scale to $1 billion, we're not gonna be able to do it on the back of a host read. That's not gonna be possible. So what we have to do is we have to adapt podcast advertising creative to go beyond the host read.
And the host read will always be the foundational ad for this medium.
Totally.
But in order to scale, we're going to need to add a little bit more to that offering.
Absolutely, and this is something that I spend a lot of my time and creativity thinking about. Sorry, just to back up real quick. There's a reason why podcast ads sound the way they do, and it's because we didn't have a lot of other choices way back when. So we didn't have ways to serve ads other than in the audio file in the RSS feed, and we didn't have a way to measure them. Advertisers didn't have a way to measure those ads except by giving an offer code so that you could then go and measure how many people clicked, because it's digital media and you can actually measure things if you're not a podcast.
Yeah, and like real quick, has anyone heard, Ricardo, if you want to play our offer code audio clip, maybe?
We killed the offer code audio clip. We're only playing the other audio clip.
Oh my gosh, we killed the offer code audio
Yeah.
clip. Raise your hand if you've heard an offer code before.
Anybody? Okay, great.
Okay, we don't
You know
need to
what
listen to that.
Yeah,
You
we're good.
know.
Aren't you guys glad we killed that one?
But the offer code was the way that you measured if someone actually listened to your
Right.
ad.
But we have more choices now.
Yeah, and so let's talk about some of those choices. And this is a lot of what Katie spends her time thinking about from day in and day out for Vox Media.
So it's basically like, how can we capture the magic of a host read in a format or a formula that is scalable and replicable, and you can play it across networks. So it's not just something that can only play on the Ezra Klein show, it's something that can play across all of Vox Media. And so that's something that we think about a lot is, okay, yes, of course there's a produced read, but maybe there's sort of like even more creative options that we can be thinking about. And it's really just sort of like, I think incumbent upon all of us, probably not all of us, but you know what I mean. But if we are going to try and figure out ways to get to $1 billion, a lot of that is going to be in iterating and innovating on what ad products we have and what ad products we can offer to larger scale advertisers. The other big and important thing about innovating on the ad product is once you get past a host read, you get to a place where you can allow the brand advertiser to have an approvals process, which is not something you can really do with a host read until after the fact, and that is also pretty huge. So we do have an example of some of the work that we are working on, and these are something that we try to sort of create like a show within a show feel so that the advertising creative feels as smart and as thoughtful and as well put together as the editorial content does. And that we do have a clip on.
Okay, Ricardo, hit it.
Your world.
Your world, your world.
Explain.
We're brought to you by InfoArmor, an Allstate company. In the old days, cyber criminals used to steal your entire identity, but institutions got pretty good at stopping that sort of thing.
Your brain is faster than a race car. Seriously, I don't know how they know that. They just do because they're scientists and I'm not. I'm Erica Wides, and this is Erica Explains, brought to you by the Great Courses Plus.
The team is counting on this moment, and the athlete tunes it all out and makes the shot. That is flow. I'm Martha Daniel, and this is Flow State Academy, brought to you by Dropbox.
So that's Katie's work right there. Thanks, Katie.
So what we were trying to, that's a lovely little smattering of applause. So basically what we're trying to do there is think about, okay, what does the listener need? What's going to be compelling and interesting for them? What are the goals of the advertising campaign? Because the fact is it's fucking advertising. They have goals and we have to meet them. And then also how is it going to fit in the greater context of the rest of the programming that it will appear in? And how will it sort of match tonally and that sort of thing?
And the way that we're thinking about this really is a lot of folks have thought, oh, I want to do a branded podcast and go all in. But what if there's a way to do that without having to build out the audience for a branded podcast and embed those sorts of storytelling opportunities within the body of existing podcasts with existing audiences?
Right. Leveraging an existing audience to tell a fun and compelling and cute or interesting or exciting brand story.
So, these are the ways that we think that we're at this inflection point and that we're scaling this business and that we're finally primed to hit $1 billion. But Katie and I also wanted to give a shout out to 6 values that we feel are going to be mission critical for us to scale to $1 billion while also maintaining our credibility, maintaining our creativity, and just not losing our soul in the process.
Yeah, we would like to keep our souls.
Yes.
Yay!
Yay to souls!
A hand for your soul.
Yeah. So first, invest in quality producers and creators. Yes.
This, I think, is so huge and so important because we need the creativity and the beautiful work that everybody in this room does. I want to bring that level of passion and intensity and creativity to the ad products. Maybe that sounds silly, but I really think that it's possible. And to do that, we need to invest in people like you, invest in them properly, and show how important that work is. It's not just slapping a voice, slapping some music on top of a voice. It's so much more than that.
And then the next thing that we need to do as we scale this business is really think about the hosts and the creators. We were talking to someone who works on a really popular podcast who's a producer there, and there's this concern sometimes that we're maybe over-leveraging the host voice in order to call out a product or an ad initiative.
There are only so many hours in a day. There's only so many words that can be said. There's also sort of a world in which, you can't like everything. You just can't. So we have to consider their time, and also a lot of hosts and creators now are absolutely important journalists who should not be touching ad copy.
It's something to think about too as we scale. And then also, how about we put the listener first? Keep in mind who's on the other end of the earbud and make sure that they're having an experience that they like, not just in the editorial content, but thinking about how the podcast sounds holistically with the ad product included in that.
And taking them seriously, because we are all podcast listeners and we are all consumers of this product, and we can all smell bullshit from a mile away. So if we build ad products that take our listeners seriously and respect their intelligence, that to me feels like the right move.
And then also, I just want to say that representation matters, and it doesn't just matter in an editorial capacity, but it matters with the voices that you're using within your ad products as well.
There's a typical VO voice, and I think that we've all heard it, and we need to get past and beyond that. And that it definitely takes a commitment. You have to go find those voices, and then you have to hire them, and then you have to pay them. And I think that that is like also completely critical. Also, I have a single lens by which I view the world, and I can't build ad products for everybody. And so we need to make sure that we are speaking to our entire audiences.
Yep, it's important, even in advertising. So yeah, when I say representation, can you guys say matters? Representation.
Oh, she's doing this.
Representation. Yes. It's important.
We had a conversation backstage. I was like, are you doing that?
I'm like,
okay.
I'm gonna do it. Call and response works, people.
She's right. It was fun.
Also, innovate on how the advertising sounds. New formats, new ways of thinking about it. It's not always gonna just be a standard read. It can be more than that.
This actually goes back to sort of investing in producers. We don't know what this stuff is supposed to sound like. It can be anything. We are at such a beautiful, magical moment where we get to decide and learn from history and figure out how advertisements work and sound, and we can do whatever the hell we want. And we are not constrained by anything except for the fact that we have 3 things that we can work with: the human voice, music, and sound effects. Beyond that, like, the sky is the limit.
Yes, ma'am. And then, finally, and most importantly, and with caps lock involved, stay authentic, people.
Yeah, this I think is super critical because, again, we get to learn from like a wealth of history. I think that podcasts are intimate and they are authentic. And yes, of course, they're scripted podcasts, but I think for the most part, it's people telling authentic stories, being real, exploring that more sort of authentic side of ourselves and our world. And I think advertisements should do the same. Like, I don't think that it makes sense necessarily to have fake testimonials. There's not even a place where you could put like this is not a real person, like little, chyron thing. So I feel like the ads should stay as authentic as the content does. It should be authentic to a show, it should be authentic to a network, and it should be authentic to the hosts as well.
Yes, ma'am. So that's our story. We're sticking to it. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you to Werk It for having us.
Oh my
and
God,
to
yes.
Denise, who's an amazing, amazing woman, and Dessa. We are open to questions. We have a few minutes if anyone has a question that they want to ask, and we'll also be available in the lobby to chat as well.
Oh, hi. Oh, I wasn't expecting a question. I'm so excited.
Hello, my name is Alina, and I am starting a podcast called Only in San Jose. It's about city planning, so it's dense stuff. But I'm taking a comedic approach to it. But besides that, my ad campaign revolves around uplifting businesses only in San Jose, like small businesses. And so I was wondering if you had advice on how to approach using this. I know it's not like a $1 billion industry for small business, but I think about how we can help uplift like the
100%.
them. And sorry, one more thing was like, instead of supporting like Amazon, like I can support woman-owned businesses and woman-made craft and like the impact for those businesses.
I mean, I think that there's a lot you can do, which is sort of just personally go down there with a microphone, and maybe that's sort of like how your ad sounds, which is like, tell me why you do this. Tell me why your business is exciting and important for the community. And I think that like hearing those voices and including those actual voices can make the ad sound just lovely and sweet and authentic, and also provides in a really dense podcast maybe sort of like a break even.
And also work with them on what the price point might look like. Meet people where they are. Like if you're going in and you're like, give me $30,000, then you shut out your opportunity to work with them as a partner. So be mindful of that for sure.
Thank you.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. Thanks.
Well, I'm happy to ask it.
Yay. Okay.
So something you talked about that I'm wondering if you could expand upon a little, this dynamic ad insertion. One thing wasn't clear to me, are you talking about this is sort of like targeted Facebook ads where you're literally, the demographics of the person who is listening at that moment and you can insert an ad in the same way that, or is it different from that? It wasn't clear to me.
I wouldn't say that, yeah, it's a little different. And I don't think we are by any means experts. I know that there are some experts floating around here somewhere who could probably answer that question even closer. I don't know that you can necessarily get quite that granular at this point. Like, I want to target, women 45 to 60 who own an Audi in Texas. I don't think you can get there just yet. However, like, that is absolutely the goal.
Yeah, I would also say that dynamic ad insertion is really just kind of mirroring the way digital ads are served, where if you go to a homepage and there's an ad on that homepage, as soon as the ad campaign ends, those ads come down and new ones are replenished. So it's similar in that way, where as soon as a campaign ends, it's stripped out, and then it helps people monetize their back catalog as opposed to maybe being baked in.
Okay, I get
Yeah.
it. Now I understand. Thank you.
Awesome.
We'll be in the lobby and happy to chat if anyone has any questions. Thank you so, so much.
Thank you.
Thank you guys so much. Thank you, Katie. Thank you, Caila. All right, we're gonna have just a very brief break, and then right at 3, you couldn't be sharper than the 3 that we're about to acknowledge. We're gonna start our next session. So if now is the time to make an origami bird, or to visit the restroom, or maybe to re-up on coffee, go. But I will see you back here at 2:59:59. Welcome back. Welcome back. Yay. All right. I am particularly excited about our next segment. We will be talking about hosting, which feels particularly meta for this particular presenter. For those of you who I haven't had the opportunity to say hello to before, hello. My name is Dessa. I'm a musician and a writer and just kind of getting into the podcasting game myself. So I will be taking special note on what I hear on stage today. That's very gracious of the preparer of said card. I have a little bracketed note that says I'm allowed to say stuff about me. Musician, writer, if you're interested, Dessa on Instagram with 2 S's. What's up, what's up, what's up? Okay, more importantly, please help me welcome our moderator for the next discussion today. We are having a conversation with 4 incredibly accomplished hosts who have a lot to say about the art, craft, and science of doing that job well. First, our moderator, Shireen Marisol Meraji. Yep. Co-host and correspondent for NPR's The Code Switch. What's up? Really? Thanks. All right, and our panelists. First, we have Rund Abdel Fattah. Come on stage. Bing, 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 bing. Misha Youssef. Yes. And we'll also be joined by Alice Wong. Thank you so much. Take it away.
Hello, how's everybody feeling? I can't see you, I wish I could see you. It's weird, there's like all these bright lights just shining in our face. I'm Shireen Marisol Meraji, and welcome to Taking Up Your Space, Real Talk About Hosting. I feel like the name pretty much speaks for itself. We're gonna talk about hosting, what has worked for us, what hasn't worked for us, what we're still working through. I'm the co-host of the Code Switch podcast. Clap if you've heard it. I co-host the podcast with Gene Demby, and we talk about race and identity and culture. Am I being too loud? Am I being okay? Okay, I'm very loud. Something I've had to work on while hosting. We talk about race and identity and culture through multiple lenses. So we talk about the news. We talk about sports sometimes. That's Gene's thing. I'm not that into sports, but we talk about art, and we talk about pop culture. So I started in this business as a producer. I was a producer for many, many years. I was a field producer. Then I became a reporter, and I became a reluctant host in 2016 when Code Switch launched. And that's me. And I'm going to have all of our panelists introduce themselves. Go for it, Rund.
Hey, my name is Rund Abdel Fattah. I'm one of the hosts of Throughline, which is a history podcast. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, it's a pretty new show. It launched earlier this year. It's a history podcast where we, our tagline is where we go back in time to understand the present. It took us a long time to come up with that tagline, so I'm gonna use that. Yeah, you know, I started at NPR as an intern 7 years ago. And then I kind of produced on all different shows, including Code Switch at a certain point, and just kind of made my way around NPR until I landed eventually on How I Built This and TED Radio Hour. I met the other host of Throughline, Ramtin Arablouei, on that show. And then we just kind of had this idea for Throughline that slowly but surely we eventually managed to get onto NPR. And you mentioned reluctant host. I was also a reluctant host and would never have imagined 7 years ago that I would be hosting today.
Alice.
Hey, everyone.
Hey, Alice.
Hey, isn't the internet awesome? I just want to say, give a shout out to Werk for including me this way. My name is Alice Wong. I'm the founder of the Disability Visibility Project, which is an online community, and I'm also the host and co-producer of Disability Visibility, an independent podcast with the goal of centering voices of disabled people in podcasting as a creator and with guests.
Misha.
Hi, I'm Misha Youssef.
Oh, that's Arwen. She's my boss. I guess better if they're cheering for you. I got my start as an independent podcast host and producer. I started a show called Beginner in early 2017, right about the time that Trump got elected, which for me ended up being a very lucky time because my podcast was about being an immigrant and not knowing how to do anything. And although quality-wise it wasn't the most amazing thing in the world, there was a hunger for that type of content. And then from there, I freelanced for a while, and then eventually landed at KPCC with Arwen, where I ended up working as a producer on the big one, Your Survival Guide, and became the host of Tell Them I Am, which came out this May, which is a podcast about the small moments that define who we are and who we are not, and the guests were all Muslim. Since we are talking about what we did in our previous lives a little bit before we started becoming podcast hosts, I want to talk about transferable skills. And were there things in your previous jobs that you feel like have really helped you become a strong podcast host or helping you evolve into being a better podcast host, Rund?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I love production. That's sort of my original passion when I came to audio, and I think thinking as a producer when you're a host is incredibly valuable, and I recommend it to everyone. Actually, I mean, whether you're a producer now or you're already a host, just like try and get a little bit more acquainted with the production side of things for a few reasons. I think first. I think you understand tape and sound just in a different way when you've had to sit with it for hours yourself and figured out like how to piece it together. Yeah. Right. I mean, you both have that experience, right? And then the other thing is I think you have a real respect for the process so that when you're hosting, if other people are now producing you, or even if you're still producing, as in I think all of our cases, you have a real sense of how much labor it takes to put something together. And I think it can really, really help in both the shaping of the product, the way you treat your teammates, and the care they're putting into the product. And I think it just makes it stronger.
Alice, before you were podcast host of the Disability Visibility podcast, what were you doing in your other life that you think helped you become a host?
Yeah, in a previous life, I was in academia and I had, training as a qualitative researcher. So I feel like I have got a really good sense of how to ask, open-ended questions.
Yes, so
that'll draw out thoughtful responses from guests. And, I'm involved in a lot of, online communities, especially on Twitter. And I feel like this helps me a lot because I'm connecting with all kinds of interesting people, engaging in different conversations, which really feeds ideas for my podcast. And I think, being online while it's a dumpster fire, it does give me a sense of the emerging issues that are important to the disability community, and also following people who have really strong voices that should be included. So that's kind of the way I've helped my hosting.
That idea of asking open-ended questions is something that even though I was a producer, I have to say I'm still trying to figure that out as a host. I catch myself asking yes or no questions all the time. I am always rewriting to make sure my question is open-ended in some way. How did you feel when this happened? Tell me about this thing, rather than, did you feel good? Did you feel bad? Anyway, so I'm still working on that. Bravo to you, Alice. Misha, what about you? What were you doing?
I was gonna say, my answer actually relates to what you're saying about open-ended questions, and I didn't piece this together until very recently. When I was in high school, I was doing a community service or part of a community service organization called a community hotline. And it was not a suicide hotline, but essentially like a pre-suicide hotline for people within the community to call anonymously, whether they were depressed or struggling with anxiety. And I did this purely because people said, if you do it for 100 or 120 hours or something, you'll go to college or it'll look great on your college resume. And the prerequisite for that, I was one of the youngest people in that whole program, and the prerequisite for that was a 45-hour listening training. And one of the things that they taught is ask open-ended questions or use verbal nods, but give people space to be silent because you don't know what might come after silence. And I keep thinking back to it recently for some reason and realizing that being trained as a listener, I think a skill that you learn as a producer as well, which is why I also highly recommend that you produce either your own podcast or produce before you become a host. But being trained as a listener is probably the most valuable skill that you will have as a host, especially if you're doing your own reporting and interviewing people.
I taught after school. I taught at 2 after-school programs, one in East Oakland where I taught capoeira, and one in Richmond, California, called Making Waves. And I was working with kids often who did not trust me and were like, who are you and why are you here? And so I learned, a skill that I learned that I think I definitely utilize as a host is trying to be relatable and relate to the people that I'm interviewing or relate to the audience in some way by being vulnerable, by showing who I am a little bit. And I think that goes against what we've been taught as journalists, actually, to stay sort of quiet and not have a personality and not let yourself be out there and be vulnerable. So that was one thing that I learned from my past life that I think has helped me a lot being a host. The next things, we've been talking a lot about producers and producing and how that helps you in hosting. And one thing as a producer that I loved was that I wasn't in front of the mic. I find this, I'm very self-critical and I find this very nerve-wracking, being on the mic and then having my voice out there for other people to listen to. So I want to talk about how, as producers, your voice has evolved, how you've been more comfortable behind the mic. And before I do that, I want to actually play some tape from Misha. We're going to hear a piece of tape from Misha when she first started hosting your independent podcast, and then something from The Big One, which you were doing at KPCC. So let's hear that tape.
13 years ago, around this time, my parents came to Los Angeles, California from Karachi, Pakistan. In Karachi, my dad owned a number of restaurants with French names. My mom was a professor, and me, I was the oldest of 2 daughters with a little brother on the way. And I was popular in school. I was only 10, but everyone knew I was going places. Maybe I'd be Prime Minister of Pakistan or a famous chef. I didn't know that place would be a whole other country.
Hey,
Okay, that was the first
listener,
one.
I'm back. This episode's even scarier, so I'm here to help. I'm Misha Youssef, in case you forgot my name. And I have 3 practical tips for you that are gonna help you survive the big one. The first tip, get water.
Okay, could you hear the difference? I could hear the difference.
I could hear the difference.
What's
Cringingly
different?
so.
What's different? No.
I mean, I think you can literally hear it in like the timbre and the cadence of my voice, where I sound a lot more like this in the second clip. In the first one, I'm like, this is my podcast voice, and I came here from, Pakistan. I think you learn over time to write to your own voice, and I think what helped me a lot is actually working with other hosts and realizing how they sometimes struggle to write to their own voices and helping them sound more natural as the producer in the room who's voice coaching them, that when it was my turn to host either the tips at the end of the big one or Tell Them I Am, I kind of understood a little bit better. And I also had an incredible team that included Arwen and Mary Knopf and James, who constantly pushed me to speak first, and then sometimes they would be the ones writing it down.
Yeah, that's
So
smart.
then I was writing totally differently than I had ever written before.
Yeah,
That's a good tip.
organically.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like that applies to interviews too, because I know when I first started, I mean, when you're producing an interview, it's so much easier to be like, well, you forgot to ask this. Like, why didn't you ask this follow-up? You know, it's like, it seems so intuitive. And then when you're sitting there, you're doing the dual thing of like listening, but also trying to like plan ahead, like, okay, where do we want to go next? And I think something that one of the producers on my team now really like helped me with in the interviews is he was like, you know, I tend to be a more of an introverted person, so that's sort of where I'm naturally more comfortable. But he was like, you know, you're curious, right? So when you're in the interview, let that lead. But then in terms of like your energy, your like pumped up level, do like 30% more than what's comfortable.
Yeah.
You know, he's like, because when it's being recorded, it comes off a little bit sounding almost like either timid or uninterested if like you're not maybe naturally as like, you know, like amped up or whatever it is. And so that, I have that in my head when I go into an interview. I'm like, okay, be me, but be a little bit more like me when I'm like, I don't know,
on
like
Sudafed.
hopped up on sugar or something, right? So that's been helpful to think about if you are introverted, which I actually think a lot of journalists are and some hosts are. You know, it isn't as natural of a fit, particularly. You know, for us, I think when we started putting this show together, we didn't have hosts in mind. We didn't initially think like, oh, we would be the host. Yeah. We just had an idea that we thought was cool, that we really want to do. And then at a certain point, we were like, you know what? Like, we're gonna need to find hosts for this. And then the more we thought about it, the more we were like, you know what? There aren't enough people who look like us who are hosts, so let's do it. And so it was not a comfortable, necessarily transition in my mind. But I felt like, you know what? Like, other people can do it, I can do it, right? And so you kind of, I think you find workarounds to your own anxieties about it.
I like to be funny in my real life. I think I'm funny, I'm goofy. But when I was hosting and when I was first starting to host, I felt uncomfortable being myself and having that kind of personality. I also tend to talk very loud. There are things about my personality, and then paired with jeans that can feel very extra. So what I did was I really did want to incorporate more of who I was. So it was really important to me to get my material down really, really well before I got into the studio so that I could riff and be funny and try things. And I'm just going to play a little bit of tape from one of those experiences if we have it.
Kanye deviated from the expected norm. Kanye got called out by everybody and dragged by everybody. People came to collect him. Kanye fell back in line.
Ish.
Yeah, ish.
And Kanye is exactly the kind of person who can deviate from the norm, right? He's a very rich rapper with a wife who is not black, in-laws who are not black. He lives in a city called Calabasas. If you've ever seen the Kardashians, you know this city. It's out here in LA County. It is 1% black, just like the Republican Party. And the only black people in Calabasas, I would bet, are dating or married to the Kardashians or the Jenners in some way. No, I'm just kidding. So yeah, not a lot of black folks to put direct and consistent face-to-face pressure on Mr. Kanye West.
Yeah, I guess it's like Kanye, Travis Scott, Black China.
All the other black people in Calabasas are gonna be so mad right now. We're gonna get so many letters, like 5. So that was a genuine interaction. That was not written down. It was genuine, and that was real laughter from Jean. So we were trying to incorporate more of that, and the way to do that is to be really familiar with your material so that you can go in and try things. And many, many times I try things that the editor's like, that was dumb, like, or that was not funny, we're not putting that in. But this one worked out okay. Alice, how did you evolve when it comes to being a host? How has your voice changed, or has it changed?
Well, I think, first of all, just to follow up what you said, I think humor is really important and being able to really show a personality. You know, I try to do that in my intros and really just kind of, you know, let my personality really come out. And I think that's what makes, you know, podcasts unique. So I really hope that people embrace, you know, all of who they are, whether they're quirky, weird or whatever. Just let it shine.
Yes.
And as you all can see, I'm wearing a mask over my nose that's attached to a ventilator, which helps me breathe. And I clearly have an intimate voice, one that you rarely hear on radio or podcasts. And as a, host, I really had to get over my own self-consciousness.
Right.
About how I sound and how I speak. And my own preconceptions of what, I think a host should sound like, because I'm not necessarily smooth or, articulate. There are times when I, pause when a breath comes in, or, there are times in the episode people can hear the whooshing of my machine. But, come to really, embrace that this is who I am, and, I want to bring all that realness, even if it may force the listener to concentrate a little more, and maybe make them uncomfortable, because it's not a quote-unquote clean or, super produced, polished sound.
Yeah.
Since I started the podcast in 2017, it's clear to me that, we need a diversity of voices in podcasting, whether that includes people like me or, voices of people who stutter, people who are deaf, people who use technology to speak. And, especially to be a podcast host, not just a guest who sounds like Darth Vader, it just kind of, delights me, because, that's the diversity media that we need.
I agree. Punto.
Yeah.
Punto.
Yeah.
So when we all had like a brief discussion over the phone, and one thing that came up that we wanted to talk about was this idea of responsibility, and the responsibility that you have as a host to your listeners, the responsibility that you have to the people that you're interviewing and who you're telling their stories. And so I did want to talk about what responsibility means for each of us as hosts. And I want to start with Alice, actually. Alice, you had some really good things to say about the role responsibility plays in hosting.
Yeah, so, with my podcast, I'm both the interviewer, co-producer, and writer, so I have a lot of creative control over who I cover and what I cover and who I invite. And, I want to hear all kinds of stories, and I feel really responsible to make an effort to interview multiply marginalized disabled people, because they will usually bring completely, unique perspective on a topic. And there's the fact that, the overall, representation of disability in media is still, very white and very male. So, that's a thing. And, I think about our role as hosts. We have a lot of power in how we frame the conversation and how we actually frame the guests. And it's my responsibility personally to accurately represent the guests in the introduction and in the show notes as much as possible. And, I really want to preserve their authentic voice. I want to overly polish them or edit them for the sake of listeners. Just as a short example, I recently interviewed Nina G, who's a comedian who stutters. And in that episode, you hear her stuttering, throughout. And I don't edit those sounds out, because that's a big part of who she is and how she presents to the world. So, the message I would just share to everyone in the audience is that it's okay to embrace the realness or messiness that comes with podcasting, because I think that'll make your podcast stand out in a good way. And I just want to give a quick shout out to my co-producer, Cheryl Green, Sarika D. Beta, and Geraldine Asu, who are all podcasters as well.
That goes against so much of what we're taught as producers, right? We are taught to polish, make it sound as perfect as possible. So that is making me think, maybe my responsibility isn't necessarily to do that. So I appreciate that point. I definitely have to say that I've been called out. I need to take responsibility for my ableism. There are things that I say in the podcast that I've said and been called out for. For example, colloquially, I always say, that's crazy, and people are like, no, you're not saying that's crazy anymore. I've been called out on Twitter for that. Recently, I said something about reading books versus listening to books. Actually, I think we should just listen to what I said so you can hear me.
We asked our listeners to suggest books that they think people might read over the summer.
Or maybe listen to, because Karen firmly believes that listening to a book counts as reading a book. I'm on the fence about that. So, that was very ableist. I got called out on Twitter because there are people who can't read books that have to listen to books. And so one thing as a podcast host that my audience has definitely made me very aware of is the tendency to be ableist. And I'm on a podcast about race and identity, and we talk a lot about social justice. And so I just want to sit here and say that, I take this responsibility really seriously, and it's something that I've been working on. Rund, when you're a host, and I don't know, what does responsibility mean for you?
Yeah, no, I mean, honestly, I appreciate you sharing that, because I think we've all sort of, when you step into the host chair, you don't realize that maybe you have some of these blind spots, right? And I think it's important to be open as you're presenting yourself in a more public light to criticism to a point, of course, because I think sometimes it's also just as healthy to block it out.
Yeah.
But I do think, particularly from the people around you that you respect, you care about, really, taking that into account. And I respect that you that you recognize that, because I've been guilty of that as well. And I also see for a history podcast, which is, what Throughline is, a huge responsibility in the way we frame the narratives, and the way oftentimes we're challenging narratives, who we're talking to in order to represent a history. We, go out of our way to tell these histories in as nuanced a way as possible, and that includes not just talking to white male historians, which I think often is the default when historical stories are being told. There are, surprise, surprise, a ton of people who are not white and male telling historical stories, particularly about their own histories. And recently we did an episode about Puerto Rico, and half the guests were Puerto Rican themselves. And, that is pretty much what we aspire to in every episode, is at least half to be not white, maybe not an American perspective if it applies, just from all different backgrounds. And I think it helps us to meet that responsibility which we've set out for ourselves, which is to tell historical narratives as truthfully and honestly as possible, and allow people from the backgrounds in which we're kind of sharing the histories to speak on their own history, which I think it surprisingly happens not often enough. And I think it just makes the show better. I think it makes the listening experience better. I think people take notice of that. And it's hard. Something Alice said that really resonated was, you're editing people, right? When you're interviewing someone, there's a lot you're leaving on the cutting room floor. And there's just as much a responsibility in terms of what you leave out as what you leave in. And I think it's really important to, one thing we do sometimes if we're, we did an episode on the history of evangelicals in America, and we were like, nobody on the team really had much familiarity with that topic or with anyone from that background. And so we were like, you know what, let's make sure that the reporter at NPR who covers, this issue listens to this episode. And we started doing that for every episode. We're like, you know what, someone who's an expert in this or who themselves is from that background should take a listen and be like, you guys are totally missing this thing, you know? And I think that really helps us stay accountable.
We do that too. Yeah, I like that. Misha?
There was kind of a strange balancing act with Tell Them I Am, because we had to both take the responsibility of representing Muslims, but also shirk that responsibility. I don't know if shirk is the right word, but also kind of like put that responsibility to the side, because even though we had 22 episodes and we tried to balance, gender identity and ethnic backgrounds and types of stories and careers, we still couldn't possibly represent 1.7 billion Muslims in the world. And so as much as we tried to be representative of American Muslims, we also had to remind our listeners and ourselves at times that we just have to be honest and vulnerable, and maybe our greater responsibility is for me as a host to be vulnerable, for my team to be vulnerable, and for our guests to allow them the space to be vulnerable and put it all out there in all of our flaws, and then let our listeners decide whether this was representative. Because ultimately we couldn't possibly bear that burden of saying like, yes, this podcast represents every Muslim that has ever existed. And one of the things that I had to keep doing over and over, sometimes on Twitter, sometimes in person to people, just in talking about the podcast, is this is not a podcast about the Muslim experience. This is a podcast about small moments, and the guests are all Muslim. And so that kind of changes the way that you perceive the whole thing, right? Where you're not expecting it to represent the entire Muslim experience.
You solo hosted that.
Yeah.
Alice is a solo host. There are two people up on the stage who have co-hosts, and I do want to talk a little bit about taking up your space when you have a co-host that you're working with, in both of our cases, who happens to be male, a man. This is gonna get fun and interesting. No, I'm kidding. Rund, do you wanna start us off? Like, how have you taken up your space when it comes to Throughline? Because I know you, and I know Ramtin. You've already said it. You're a little bit introverted. He's a big personality. There's a gender difference. There's a lot I think you could say if you felt comfortable saying.
No, I mean, to start off, Ramtin's a great co-host because I think he is so receptive to feedback. And so it's not that he always gets it right, or that like the dynamic is always perfect, but it's that that's the first thing, is whoever you're co-hosting with needs to be open. It's sort of like a work, like, I don't know, like work marriage, honestly. It's like you are investing so much of yourself in it, and as are they, and you're in it together, you're trying to like build this thing together, and it's really important to have open communication. So, early on, we had times where we would be in an interview and the guests would just not look at me. They would only direct their attention to Ramtin. And it's nothing he did, it's just he's the man in the room. And it was like the attention would automatically gravitate to him. And one way we started kind of counteracting that is, I always start the interviews now, where I'll lay out the show, what the show's about, like all the sort of like nice setup stuff. I'll do that because it forces the guests to recognize you're in the room, which I know it sounds kind of ridiculous. I mean, I would have thought that was ridiculous hearing it before, but then, sitting in that room, I mean, literally, they just won't look at, some guests would not look at me. They would only direct their attention to Ramtin. So that really helped. And again, like having a collaborative partner who's an ally was important. Someone who was, he recognized, that is an issue, and we're gonna take steps to try and counteract that. And even within the team, right? I mean, there are times, we've talked about this, but there are times when, you end up taking on so much of the labor and it's not being recognized maybe. And even within the team then, there becomes this like, weird imbalance, and it can make you resentful, frankly, right? And so I think it's really important to address that. And so one of the things that we did was I started leading the team meetings, because again, even to the team, it would make it feel like there was a weird assumption of authority that was given to him that was not immediately given to me. And so by doing that, it sort of like counteracted that as well. You know?
That's great. I'm a producer, so I have a lot of production skills. And when it comes to doing the labor, I do a lot of producing behind the scenes. And Jean came from print, so we just have very different skills. I find that I was getting very resentful because I was cutting a lot of tape. I was pulling interviews. I was doing all of this work that doesn't get recognized when, we're 50-50 splitting things up on air. And so, yeah, having open communication about that has been really wonderful. I also pushed to get a title change. My title was co-host and reporter for NPR, and I was like, you know what? I'm a senior producer of this show. I'm senior producing this show. So I finally, so I pushed to get a title change, although we don't say that in the credits. We don't say Shreem Marisol Meraji, senior producer, but it will be on my new cards, and that will make me feel good.
Shireen, it's actually something that we had to do is like change the credits of our shows because we realized that some of the assumptions that come with someone hosting a show were not necessarily true of all the shows that we were making. And so for us, it started early this year, and we started specifically writing out who are the writers on this episode, who are the sound designers on this episode, who are the producers, who are the editors, and that, I think, put a little bit more pressure on the hosts that we were working with, but also just made us feel better about the labor that we were putting in as producers.
Yep.
So I think as co-hosts, too, that would be
I like this. Another thing is, my therapist always says, and what's your role in all this? So listening back, because I do feel like, even though I find it very torturous to listen back to myself, listening back has helped me become a better host. And one thing that I did notice listening back was I was often playing the role of the listener in the interviews or in the hosting. Like, I was playing the role of the person who didn't know things. So please explain them to me. And even though I did know things, I knew all the things, or maybe, many of the things. But I was always the one taking on that role of like, oh, yes, please enlighten me. And Jean was taking on the role of, yes, I will enlighten you. And so one example of where I decided I'm gonna put my foot down on this, or I'm gonna change the way that I'm doing this, is oftentimes you write a question because it'll get you from point A to point B, and so often the question is, oh, I didn't know about that, tell me about that thing. I mean, obviously it's a more articulate question than that. And we were working on the Black Republicans episode, which you just heard a clip from, and Jean had written a question in my script that was like, oh, I've never heard of Mia Love, tell me who she is. And we were in the edit, and I was like, Jean Demby, I told you to book Mia Love for this episode. I am not going to ask this question this way. And so he was like, oh, my bad, let's work. I was just doing that so we could get from point A to point B. True, we do this all the time. But I was like, okay, how about we do it like this? I can say the things I know about Mia, and then I can say a thing I don't know about Mia, and then that's the transition. So the thing I didn't know was how she got to Utah. So if you listen to the episode, I'm like, oh yeah, Mia Love, her parents were Haitian immigrants. She grew up in New York. I think I said that. And but I don't know how she got to Utah, how she gets to Utah, and that worked out. But I am putting my foot down for always being the person that doesn't know the thing, especially as a woman. I know a lot.
Yeah. Well, yeah, honestly.
And just to call myself out one last time quickly, I just did this on the podcast episode this week, actually, with Hansi. I was like, oh, I've never thought of this. Tell me about it. And my husband was like, what are you talking about? We had a conversation for hours about prison gerrymandering. Of course you've thought about it. And so, yeah,
I mean, actually,
it's a work
to that
in progress.
point, I think, so early on when we were trying to figure out, like, how do you banter on tape, right?
Yeah.
And We didn't always get that right. And the thing is, I think people could hear when we didn't get it right, and that also applied to questions that seemed like we were pretending to not know something that we knew, and we realized we were like, okay, there's plenty of stuff we don't know. I mean,
Yes,
particularly
definitely.
with a historical. I mean, there's some topics that I just don't know much about, and so yeah, there's a lot more than questions that are maybe like seem a little more basic, but they're just that's where my knowledge like ends on something, right? And I think we started telling ourselves like we should only write in a question that feels sincere or like authentic, something like we would actually like think about, even if like sometimes in an interview you almost stage something so that the interviewer can like really break something down, like as if you were like an alien coming into it and like you don't know, right? Like you've literally landed from outer space, like explain this to me, right? That's like a go-to thing. I mean, even when we were framing questions like that, we were making sure that it still sounded like it was framed in research, like you had done your research to get to a point where like you were asking that question in some way, because for a woman especially, I think it really is easy for people to write you off, unfortunately, right? Particularly if you're a younger woman, right? There's something about just the tone of your voice that makes people think, oh, you must not know as much. And so, with that in mind, it sucks, and it's unfortunate that that's the reality you're up against, but finding these workarounds is so important.
A really easy one, for people who may not know, you could just do that instead of I may not know or I don't know,
Yeah.
So that's a quick trick. Okay, so time is running out. I'm going to, obviously we have some aspiring hosts in the audience. I would actually like to hear you clap or yell or something if you are an aspiring host. Yes, good. Exciting times.
Nice.
I was hoping that we could all share some advice for you all out there, something that you wish someone had told to you that maybe they didn't. And Alice, I'd love to start with you. Some advice for aspiring hosts.
Yeah, I loved how we all talked about the kind of labor it takes, because I do think a lot of people who are getting into podcasting or just our listeners have no idea the amount of care and effort it takes to produce one episode, much less an entire season. So, for all the aspiring hosts out there, just know that there's a lot of work that happens even before the interview or, afterwards during the editing process. I think one of the keys is to make the guests comfortable ahead of time. And sometimes they need information on, what to expect and, reassuring them that they're going to do great. Especially if it's their first time on a podcast. Because I think we should always remember that it can be really intimidating and, they're putting trust in you. So, back to the responsibility thing, it's, there's a big, risk they're taking in spending their time and energy with you. And I guess my other bit of advice is that, for hosts is to kind of resist centering yourself by setting your thoughts or opinions constantly, during an interview, because this is just my philosophy, but, I want to let the guests shine and, have me as a host to really act as a facilitator and guide, and to always show gratitude to the guest at the end. So those would be my bits of advice.
Misha?
So when I started hosting, I definitely was imitating other people, and it took me a while to unlearn that. So I highly recommend that you don't imitate anybody. I know it's a natural instinct, and it's okay if you do, but do anything it takes to sound like yourself. Like if you need to record yourself while you're in the bathroom, because that's where you're most comfortable, do that. If you need your partner or your parent or your best friend in the room with you, and just have a conversation and have them ask you questions that prompt you to say the lines of your script, do that. Like literally whatever it takes for you to feel like yourself and to assume your natural tone of voice and your natural humor and your natural physical demeanor. I think that's the place to start. And if I could go back, that's where I would have started instead of trying to sound like Ira Glass, because I don't look like Ira Glass.
Yeah, that's good advice. Yeah, I think the first piece of advice would be, like, don't be afraid to, like, just fail. Like, honestly, just try things, and a bunch of stuff isn't going to work out, but that's how you're going to find the things that do work out. And I mean that in terms of interviewing, in terms of when you're tracking, in terms of like stand up, sit down, like, you know, see what works, like, you know, maybe write it out, maybe don't write it out, maybe like have someone write it out for you. Like, you know, everybody's gonna have a different style. So I think you need to just try things, and going along with that, be open to criticism and try not to be defensive about it. I think I struggled with that initially, especially. It's an ongoing struggle, but I think especially at the beginning, all of a sudden, especially if you're a producer, you're coming from that, you're not used to having you yourself be the part of the package, right? All of a sudden, you're part of this thing that you're putting out in the world. It's very vulnerable. Like, you have to be vulnerable. You have to be open to feedback, because that's the only way you're gonna get better. It's the only way you're gonna realize what works or doesn't work. And then, you know, in terms of the creative process of it, just one thing we tell ourselves on my team is like, if we listen to an episode a year from now, we hope that it sounds so much better than it does right now.
Yes.
Like, we want to keep
And it
growing.
will.
I mean, yeah, I hope it does. That's our goal, is like, we want to listen back and be like, that was okay, that was good, but like, we've gotten better. And the only way to keep getting better is to be like really honest with yourselves as a team, to have a lot of space as a team to be like open with each other. And final note, on that note, if you end up as a host, I think it's so important to foster an atmosphere of like kind of an egalitarian atmosphere. There's a lot of top-down approaches, and maybe that works for some teams, but I know for our team, it was super important to Ramtin and I from the beginning to make sure that everyone felt like they had a voice, and I think the product is getting better as a result. And so, you know, yeah, those are
Trust your
pieces of
team.
advice. Yeah.
Yes, I love that. Be nice to yourself. It's hard, and one thing that I have to say is that I cringe every time I listen to myself. But the more reps you put in, the better you become. That definitely happens. You will sound better a year from now. So just remember that and try to be gentle and kind to yourself. That's it. And we're done. We have triple zeros. We actually had triple zeros a while ago. I don't know if that means that we don't have time for questions or if we're taking questions. No time for questions. We talked way too much. I hope you got what you wanted out of this. Go forth and host.
Yeah.
Thank you, Alice.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Alice. Did we get any music to walk off to or anything? No.
If I just like soft shoe for a second, yeah. Does this feel more final? Thank you so much to our panelists and our moderator. Brava, thank you for the Frank Council. I feel like I earned your trust when I told you we were going to start at exactly 3, and then we did. We're going to start at exactly the top of the hour. So I will see you in like 11 minutes. Ready? Break. We are now entering a very final session of the evening. We're gonna make a transition from our last conversation where we were talking about hosts. During this conversation, we'll be talking about listeners, about shifting our attention to the audience for whom we're producing our work. I'm feeling real like high school. Like, hey, listen up, Werk It Festival. We're almost done. Listen up here, okay? Okay. That was such an anemic yay. Thank you. Me too, man. Me too. Shake it off. Here we go. Please help me welcome our moderator for this conversation on audience, Christina Kim. She is a producer, yes, for KQED's Truth Be Told. I already spent a moment fangirling backstage. I think some of that content is just so moving. Like, stop the chore, send it to your mother kind of moving. And our panelists who will be joining us for this conversation are Tanya Mosley. Yes. Camille Stanley. And Barry Syke. Take it away.
Thank you. All right, everybody, how's LA doing today? Thank you so much for joining us for this last session. We're so pleased to be here, and we're gonna be talking about audience. So there's this common adage that when you make something for everyone, you make it for no one. The truth is, in audio, that when you make it for everyone, you're making it for white people. And more specifically, you're making it for white, middle to high income, cisgender straight folks. I will say it again. White, middle to high income, cisgender straight folks. Unfortunately, when you're making audio, especially in legacy public media institutions, there can be a real push to do just that. Make it about whatever you want. You have free reins to do whatever you want. But make sure it appeals to everyone, okay? We don't want to isolate our listeners, i.e. our white listeners. And we here on this panel think that's a real disservice to the power of audio, which allows folks to connect with one another, and more specifically, to make people of color feel seen. And we're not talking about in that anthropological sense. Feel seen, I see you kind of things. So that's what this panel is about. We're gonna blow that all up, we're gonna spill some tea, and we're gonna show you that how by constantly asking yourself, who am I making this for? And really asking yourself, who the hell am I making this for? You can build a podcast and really reach the audience you want, which for everyone here is people of color. So let's get started. Let me introduce you to this badass panel of ladies. Right here, I've got Tanya Mosley. She is the producer and host of Truth Be Told, as well as now the co-host of Here and Now. Tanya Mosley. And here in the center with these lovely blue lips and these pink heels is Camille Stanley. She is now the senior producer of The City from the USA Today and formerly the co-host and producer of We Live Here. And finally, we have Barry Syke, the creator and mastermind behind Podcast in Color. I know most of you know her. She's doing all the work here, getting us all our names out there. So welcome, Barry. And here are the beautiful logos that represent these women but can never fully encapsulate everything they do. Boom, 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 boom. Truth Be Told, Podcast in Color, and The City. All right, so what are we talking about today? We're talking about audience. So I'm gonna ask each of you actually to just go one by one, and I'll start with you, Tanya. So when we're talking about audience, what do we mean when we say, who are we making this for? I know we worked together on Truth Be Told, so early on we were tasked with defining our audience and comparing our show's audience to other people, but we kind of took a different approach. Who is Truth Be Told's audience, and how did we come up with that? How do we contrast with the other ways that the Legacy Newsroom was doing that?
Yeah, so we were given the opportunity to make Truth Be Told. At the time, I worked for KQED. And just to give you a little backstory, Truth Be Told was a podcast and a show on KQED back in 2015, 2016. It was before the presidential election. And so when we were given this opportunity to reimagine Truth Be Told, both Christina and I really thought deliberately about what audiences we need to serve that aren't currently being served, and what is the void that we're trying to fill. And so that's really how we came to this idea. If we're going to make a podcast, so what is the podcast in 2019 that people need to hear right now? We're in a different time than we were back then before President Trump was President Trump. And so when Trump was President Trump, you get what I'm saying. So that's really how we came to this idea of people of color. Now, there's also been a lot of talk about that term, people of color, and what that truly means. And so for us, we were very deliberate in thinking about, we were talking about Black and brown people, and in the Bay specifically, we were thinking about the audiences that we would love to hear more from and answer questions from. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that a little bit later, but yeah, that's how we came to that.
Great. And Camille, can you tell us a little bit more about, I want to talk about specifically because I know you work so much on We Live Here, and in some ways you had to switch up who your audience was in the middle of production. And I think we really want to talk about that because some of you are probably already making podcasts, and so it can be really easy to be like, okay, it's too late for us to reach or redefine our audience because it's going to make us shift in the middle. But Camille, you were able to do that. So can you talk about a little bit about what the podcast is and who you were making it for, and then that shift?
Yeah, so I moved to St. Louis maybe 4 years ago after being a newspaper journalist, where I made a lot of stuff for everyone and no one. And then I went to a public radio station where I was, again, making stuff for everyone and no one. And I specifically moved there to do this podcast about race and class for the station and PRX. And we didn't really know who our audience was. Because as a journalist, I hadn't really been thinking that deeply about who my audience was, or if I was thinking about it, it was very broad. But about 2 seasons in, we were challenged by PRX to say, like, they asked us, who is your audience? And we were like, it's like curious people who are, interested in race and class. And they were like, that's not an audience. And so they really challenged us to think deeply about it and to stop, pause, and pivot and figure out who we were making the show for. When we first started, it was very interesting because clearly I am a Black woman. I co-hosted the show with the white man, and I worked with mostly white people. And so how they answered that question, they were like, well, our audience is who we think the public radio audience is. And I was like, nah, Black people listen to this show. And they were like, how do you know? I was like, because I talked to them. And they were like, oh, okay. So that was their first inkling that maybe who we have in our audiences is not actually who is listening to this show and who is being impacted by this show. That really set us off to then pause everything that we were doing and really figure out from our existing audience and other people and strangers, did they even need a show about race and class? If they needed it, what it was gonna do for them. And so we really put the brakes on and put ourselves in a, I think, very vulnerable but very necessary position of figuring out, like, is your show actually needed? And in podcasting, there's just too many choices, and if you're not making something that's meaningful to people, it's not gonna stick, right? You're not gonna get listeners if you're not solving something for them, if they can't find a place for you in their life. And so we had to do that.
How many people are familiar with We Live Here? Just applaud. Okay, for everyone who's not, though, can we talk about where is this based and why is it such a particular question about who are we making this for? Because I think with We Live Here, it matters.
It definitely matters. So I was at a public radio station doing a show about race and class, co-hosting it with a white dude in a part of the country that had, and that still has, quite a bit of national attention on it when it comes to those issues, and dealing with a lot of the stuff you deal with if you're in media, like distrust with the community, valid, all that good stuff. And so once we really figured and honed in on, like, who actually our audience was, and we stuck to that, it really changed our show. And getting the station to realize that who our audience was is not something, it was not someone that they were focusing on in any of their other content, and being extremely strategic and intentional about like, nope, this is our audience, so that is who we tell everything, that's our lens. Just like you're telling most of your story through an invisible lens that you don't talk about, we're intentional and we will talk about it out loud. This is who our lens is for.
We got a little audio clip here that you have. Do you want to set it up for us?
We do. So these words, you're probably like, what? What the heck do these words mean, right? So Race and Class, obviously, that's what the show was about. When we first started, we had a very public radio-y tagline. Our show was race, class, power, poverty, systems, and the people they touch. Right? Sounds very public radio-y, because it was. We transitioned after we did our audience work to we were a show for people somewhere on the woke spectrum. Because that's what we found that's who our audience was. Shanice is our #1 audience member. She's a 30-something Black woman who needs all sorts of things from us, and that's who we make the show for. Damon is probably her fanboy. And Damon is a white guy, because remember, I co-hosted with the white counterpart. Damon also wanted to listen to those episodes and needed certain things from the show, but we made the show for Shanice. And Jesus, Jesus is who he is.
Why not? All right, let's take a listen.
Hey everyone, I'm Jesus, and I'm Black.
Oh, so do you go by Black Jesus?
No, of course not. Do you go by Black Camille or do you go by White Tim?
Okay, point taken.
Yeah, so why bring it up when you introduce yourself?
For centuries, my brother and sister, people have been making all these statues and pictures of me as a white guy, which is weird, because I'm not a white fella.
I mean, are you sure about that? Because I could have sworn that you're a white dude.
You're not alone. I get that from a lot of white folks, my brother, especially the Christians.
So Jesus was our first guest in our first episode after we went through our audience work and after we identified who our show was for, and after I had kind of a creative moment, and I was like, let's just tell it like it is. I was just frustrated and I was venting. I was like, I was like Jesus, like everybody know he's not white, and other people in the room were like, and I was like, Jesus is not white. She's Black. And we were like, we had to do we were working on like a pilot or something, and I was like, let's do Black Jesus. And they was like, how are we gonna do Black Jesus? And I was like, we're just gonna do Black Jesus. And we did Black Jesus. And after that, everybody knew that like our show had changed. It was clearly intentional, and that we were just gonna, we had made a big pivot.
All right, Barry, so I'm really excited that Camille recommended you for this panel, because you're not a podcast creator for a legacy organization. You are instead a key figure in curating and helping audiences of color find podcasts by people of color. That is a huge freaking job. And so you're also in dialogue, directly in dialogue with the audiences that we're trying to make things for, we're trying to reach. And so when you're thinking about this question, who is this for? How do you recognize that? How, when you're listening and curating and like deciding to highlight podcasts, how are you thinking about that question and the way that you're highlighting work?
I was telling somebody, I make things as if I was the audience member. It's like, I live in Denver, Colorado. I'm not in New York or LA like most people. My favorite podcast is The Read. And I'm like, I'm always on social media. People understand that. And I'm like, but how do other people really find the things that I'm finding, and where is that at? And I was like, so I'm gonna approach it as if I was approaching this and I didn't know anything. And how do I find this? So I'm gonna go to a website, because my first thing is always gonna be Google. And I really just started from there. Everything I do, I think like, if I didn't already know this, how would I find this? And what are the steps that I would do? Am I searching keywords? Am I asking a friend? Am I gonna be on Instagram searching hashtags and different things? And I've really more looked into how people use that, especially people of color. We're big on hashtags, of course we're big on Twitter, and other things like that, and really trying to use all the things that we use on a regular basis to reach other people like me, and it's worked that way. So I find that as long as I'm doing things where I'm like, this is where I would be, so I know other people like me are here, it's a thing. I tell people how I started in this is, like I said, I'm a fan of The Read, and on SoundCloud, you can see how many people listen. And so on SoundCloud, refreshing for The Read to publish on Thursdays when it used to, I used to notice that, like, you know, within the first hour, we're going from 0 to like 10,000. And I'm like, so there are other people on here that are all waiting, you know, for this. And all the live shows I've been to for the read and things like that, unlike, I'm in Denver, so like when I go to a music or anything that's a rap and it's a Black person, it's a crowd full of white people. Unlike that, when I go to podcast live shows and it's a Black podcast, it's full of Black people. And so I'm like, there has to be something. And if I keep doing this, I know I can reach the people that are listening. You know, I was like, I can't buy ads on these things. I don't have any money. So literally just using social media and then saying, I can do this. And let me use the way that I would think about things to reach people that are looking for the things I'm looking for. And that's worked so far. So, I mean, I know it's possible, which is why when people only reach out to white people, I'm like, I know it's possible because it's mostly POC people that find me from all over the world. So, you know, it's a part of that.
But what I'm hearing also from you is that there was a gap that you're filling, right? When you first went to look for other podcasts beyond The Read, you're like, hey, I want to listen to more podcasts by Black creators, by people of color creators. I mean, you weren't finding that is what I'm hearing.
It's more pop culture. It's very easy to find somebody talking about what's talking about on Twitter, find somebody talking about, you know, like politics or like the latest thing that they feel like somebody wants to hear, but who's talking about the things we regularly talk about? You know, who's talking about like the history of things we've done? Who's talking about the books that we read? Because I'm a very big romance book reader.
Me too. I know.
Who's talking about like the other things that we are open to? Business, entrepreneurship, beauty, wine, food. I'm like, there's a variety of things. And so I went through searching and trying to fill that gap and trying to like gather people to say like there is a bigger industry, because a lot of things is I would find a person and they felt like they were alone, and my thing was like, if I can connect you to, for you to understand there is a bigger industry, there are other POC podcasts, then you can grow past making something that you feel like is not being made, if it's being made, to what you really want to make, and trying to fill that gap of things that we really don't have, instead of a lot of people making the same thing because they think they're alone, then they find me or something else and they're like, oh, there are a lot of other podcasts like this. I could have made the podcast on yarn or something that I really wanted, but I thought that they needed to hear from these people because nobody was hearing from them, but really we're just not highlighted or featured, which is what I started doing, so that people can find the other kind of things.
So each and every one of you have defined your audience, which in some ways can be the easy part. I want to reach these people, but then comes the work and also sometimes the challenges. So Tanya, I wanted to ask you, so once you know who your audience is, like, now what? And for us, you know, the goal was make a podcast for POCs. But how do you actually go about reaching that audience and then also making sure that that content is reflective of the diverse experiences within that umbrella term?
Right, well, that's a great question. Camille brought up something that I kind of dealt with as well during my time at KQED, although it wasn't as specific. People weren't overtly saying, well, our audience is just white, and so there aren't any really people of color. Are they really listening to us? But in other ways, I was hearing that, and so when we came up with this, when we decided that we wanted to focus on people of color and make a podcast not only by, because we were our people of color, but for people of color, I just thought, we both thought that the first thing we need to do is to hear from people. We know from our circles that people listen to KQED. We know the things that they're yearning for, but let's hear from them about what they want in a podcast from KQED. So we had this idea that we wanted to do an advice show, but we wanted to hear from folks about what they wanted in an advice show. So we held various listening sessions where we kind of pitched our idea to them. I heard from folks within KQED say to me, well, you know, you may not get a lot of people to show up, but even though still, it's a nice idea that you're gonna have these listening sessions. Well, we
planned them in a week.
We planned them in a week. We got some food, we got some drinks, and on a weekday night, we had a large group of people come to KQED, which I think is also important. If you work for a legacy news organization, it's important to invite people of color to your organization. Now, there are two schools of thought on this. there's a thought that, hey, you should go to where they are, which is important as well. You should be going to where they are. But you also want to show them that they're important enough that you want to bring them into the fold. You want to bring them into the building. So when we had our first listening session, there were people who came who said, I've lived in the Bay Area all of my life and I've never been here. It's so nice to be inside of this building. And so I realized that meant a lot for them to be able to be thought of in that way, that they were important enough to come in the building, but also that we wanted to hear from them. So we held these listening sessions, and then we had breakout sessions where we asked them questions. What would they want in the show? If we were to take on questions, what would they like? What topics would they like for us to do? It was also eye-opening because a lot of them said to us, I mean, more than a few, is KQED really behind this? I know that you said it's by and for people of color. Are they really down with this? Is this gonna be for the long haul? Is this a gimmick? And then they also ask things like, well, where are the folks in larger management? We see that you're here, but are they really behind you? And that's important too when you're thinking about audiences of color because they've seen things come and go. We're not the first ones to ever think about targeting an audience. You know, if you talk to people who've been in the business, I talk with journalists who've been in the business since the 60s and 70s. They've also had these projects where they've tried to reach out. And maybe they've had a show on regular radio, and that show was on, and that the people of color thought it was very popular, Black people, for instance. And then, 2 years later, the show goes away, and there's the perception that the legacy organization was not interested in investing in that show. So I say that to say it's very important to know that when you reach out to people, and you want to hear what they have to say, that you also listen to them, and then you bake that into your project. And that's what we did. We listened to them. We got something like over 200 questions and we were only gonna make 6 episodes the first run. And from our listening sessions, Christina and I just put them all out on Post-its and then put them into themes, and we saw that there were themes. And from there, we started to build the show.
And I want to talk, and Camille, I think you can speak to this as well as Tanya. So I think, depending on where you are, there's this kind of blurred line between producer and audience. And sometimes your editor will be like, we can't just appeal to the audience. Like, you are a reporter, you are a producer, you have to create the content. So there's that blurred line. But I think that tension gets particularly exacerbated when it's crossing gender and race. Can you talk a little bit about that? So like this idea of like you're pandering to your audience and what that means when you're a creator of color, especially a woman of color.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. There's an interesting thing that happens, I think, if you're a creator of color, where when you do something and it's intentional and targeted toward your community, you get a lot of second guessing. Or people will be like, well, I mean, then maybe they'll say something about bias or things like that. And I'm like, look, nobody talks to like white people or white reporters about like what are they bringing to when they're doing their stories. How are they framing? What framing are they using? And why they're so invested in this story about X. Where if I'm doing a story about housing or gentrification or something like that, or I'm bringing like Shanice, this will really appeal to Shanice because like she told me it appeal to her. Like this is something that she cares about. Like, well, I mean, are you sure? Or there's a line there. Yeah, it happens. And I think that doing the audience work though gives you the backup because it's much more powerful if you can say, we're making this show or we're not making this show because it's not for our audience, as opposed to we're not making this show because I'm not interested in it as a journalist, or I'm making this show because it's a really good story. I mean, there were stories after we did our audience work that we killed because we were like, it's not for Shanice. Like, she doesn't care about it. So, and there were stories that, as someone who's a trained journalist, that like I probably would have done. They would have been easy. I would have thought. I mean, they were in the realm of race and class, but they were not for our audience. And once you hone in on who that audience is, and you really kind of use it to evaluate everything you're doing, it's changed like how I do my job, how I approach my work. And I think it's especially important in podcasting because, again, there's so much noise in podcasts that if you're not making, if you're not making something that's meaningful for people, it's not going to stick.
Like I like what Camilla's saying. There was a panel yesterday where they were like, can you take feedback and how do you take in that feedback? And a lot of people don't ever ask for feedback, or if they get any type of feedback, which is in tweets or an email or something, it's immediately taken as like, I can't believe that person said that. I can't believe they insulted my audio. I can't believe they asked me, maybe could I clean up the audio or not chew gum on the mic, or can I, do this, or different things. And it's like, it really is important, like how the panel said yesterday, is how do you take in feedback to be able to not like take it as an affront of that somebody is asking a question or asking for more, but being able to take in feedback and pour it back into your podcast. And I feel like podcasts that reach POC are really good at getting feedback, looking at what people are saying about the podcast and applying that to the podcast to reach more people of color. Because there's always gonna be a gap, or like, this is how you can reach me and it seems like you're talking to somebody else. I don't know like how you're doing this, is that right? And a lot of people don't really take that in, or if that happens, they're like, I can't believe somebody said that,
I mean,
that's really
I think with this, like doing this audience work, like there was a shift in my brain of like, not only who I was making something for, but like who was my boss, right? Like I no longer thought of my boss as my boss. I thought of the audience as my boss. I wanted to make something for them. I wanted to make something with them. I was wanted to see that the feedback that I was getting, and I, did my storytelling thing and put it back out into the world, like it meant as much to me how it landed with them. And look, I've been a journalist for a long time. I got thick skin. I used to be a crime reporter. Like, I'm used to people, cussing me out, slamming doors in my face, things like that. But there is still a different level of intimacy that we have with our audiences as podcasters. And there's just a difference in how we think of them. Like with after we did our audience work, like it wasn't just one time. We didn't just do it at the beginning, like Tanya and Christina. Like throughout the year, we brought people back and kept making sure, like, okay, how are we doing now? How are we doing now? We're making this show with you. You want to hear a little bit of, like, let's test out some audio with you. And that was a totally different way that other people within my organization were doing their jobs, were doing their journalism. And, I'm sure some people thought we were crazy, but, the results spoke for themselves.
Yeah. And what both of you guys are saying brought to mind to me what we're really talking about too in building podcasts for people of color. It's about decentering whiteness, and that's a journey that you will be on for the rest of your life. But taking feedback from your audience really gets you closer to that mission. And so, you mentioned Camille as a journalist and you being out in the field, and you do stories and you do them, because that's what you do. There's a certain level of undoing what you learned to be able to build yourself back up to create something specifically for an audience. And that decentering of the whiteness and listening to your audience when they give you that feedback, you think you hit the mark, but it's like, no, wait a minute, maybe I need to do this, or maybe I need to change or shift and evolve, as you both are saying, is a work in progress that happens throughout the process.
And I think, going back to you, Tanya, so I think something that we both weren't prepared for is that feedback. That when you talk to your audience, you have to be willing to hear things that you don't want to hear. Like, they're really gonna question you. I know, Tanya, like that day, like thought we were gonna have like this nice presentation about our work and talk about advice, but we were like put on the grill, specifically around like, who is this show for? Do you wanna talk a little about that and then how we got to make the show we made?
Yeah, I mentioned earlier how they were asking us how committed KQED was to the project, which KQED has been very supportive of this project, which is amazing because I have worked at lots of places throughout my career where if I had brought up, hey, we want to do a show just for people of color, they'd been like, okay, yeah, that's nice, Tanya. We hired you. That's why you're here. You are our color, So it's true.
Y'all know
but
what happens.
KQED is very evolved in thinking about these things and allows us, we're doing a second season and we're continuing on because of that. But yeah, they asked us specific questions about how committed KQED was, who this is for, how over time they've seen, there are a lot of systemic issues within the Bay Area that they said over time, feeling marginalized within the Bay Area as it shifts and changes. And so we finally came up with something that we felt really proud of and really spoke to the authenticity of what our audience was asking. And yeah.
Yeah, here you can take a listen to all the voices that made that.
Let's talk for a minute. I am obsessed with getting and giving advice. I can't get enough.
Dear Abby.
Dear Miss Manners.
Dear Miss Manners.
Dear Abby. I need your help.
But sometimes, well, let's be real, a lot of the time, the most popular advice shows and columns leave people like me, people like us, Black, brown, Indigenous, and Asian folks, out of the conversation.
Is it okay to feel huge, phenomenal, amazing joy when it seems like the rest of the world is burning?
I'm Tanya Mosley. Welcome to Truth Be Told, the advice show you've always wanted.
We need to love women of color more and kind of be more generous.
You are my, yes, we're giving each other high fives in here over that. If the other shows are telling you how to blend in and behave, we explore how you can be you in a world that doesn't always want you to just fully be. A place where you can laugh, cry, bitch, moan.
Every day I wake up and I'm just like, okay, so how am I gonna handle this, or how am I gonna do this?
Yep, we all have different experiences in this country, but Truth Be Told is intentional when we say people of color. This show is a place where we meet at the intersection of not only our oppression, but our resilience, allowing us to ultimately discover the truths that lead us all closer to feeling whole.
What would you do if you weren't afraid? When I'm really honest with myself about the answer to that question, that's exactly what I'm supposed to do.
Each week, me and a brilliant special guest will unpack your questions, predicaments, and experiences about race and culture in these United States. Truth be told, we see you, we feel you, we hear you. Hear us anywhere and everywhere you get your podcast. And click that little subscribe button now so you won't miss a minute.
I do want to say a couple of things, and Camille brought this up as well, but every step of the way also, including people of color, so Black and brown people, when it comes to the logo, when it comes to the design, all of those things were important. And so really, if you're thinking about being an ally, it's really simple. It's like stepping out of the way. So collaborating with those folks who want to create podcasts within a space, but then also allowing yourself to step out of the way to allow those things to happen. And so what was beautiful is we were able to actually do that, where we had folks who were able to come in and give their ideas and thoughts and opinions to make this podcast authentically their own. And that's a big part of it, because oftentimes we feel like, okay, I've seen it happen where someone feels like I'm such an ally that I need to be in a big part of this. I need to have my fingers in the mix. And no, a big thing that you can do is just support. I mean, that's a huge part of being able to continue this work.
And really quickly, I'm going to go to Camille, but I just want to, this is some images you're seeing here is that at the end of Truth Be Told, we had a live event where we invited a lot of the people who had given us the questions, who had helped us make the show, and then new listeners to come join in a night of a live taping. And I think that's something to bear in mind. We're talking about focusing our audiences, which doesn't mean use your audience. Like, you are in a relationship with them. You want to be in constant dialogue, like Camille is saying, to use their expertise, but be in dialogue with them so they're not just feeling used. But Camille, I really want to talk to you really quickly. I think it's really easy to say, hey, we want to reach people of color, our local community, in your instance, specifically Black listeners. But it can be really hard in a white newsroom to be like, hey, hold up, we're not reaching that audience. How do you actually have that conversation? How do you get people on board in an instance where the show's already running and you haven't already had the conversations where you're like, we're gonna do this, we're getting the green light, we're going into our own corner? You had to do a lot of negotiating and collaborating. How do you get people on board and stay sane?
I think I was lucky in that the point at which I entered that newsroom and started on that show, there was a lot of white guilt flowing. And so they were, they were kind of primed for maybe not necessarily knowing what it would mean if I suggested something, but they were feeling the pressure. And a lot of times in those moments, you just go for it. And it also happened to be good that I wasn't a baby reporter anymore. I had already had some accomplishments. I was much more assertive as a woman. And so I just kept pushing back on things. And again, doing the work, I had evidence behind me, right? It was easier for me to be like, we're making this show for this person because here she is right here. And here are all these other people who tell us that we're doing it this way. As opposed to just like, I just want to make this thing because I think it will be cool. Just trust me. They don't trust you, right? So you have to show them, and you have to bring your evidence, and you have to, then you got to deliver. So.
Is there any particularly hard conversation that you had to get people on board, or you were able to really?
No, like I said, use the white guilt.
Yeah. To your advantage.
And Barry, even the best laid plans for a podcast can't go far if your listeners aren't coming with you. So on your side of things, you're kind of seeing the whole landscape. And I know that you look at podcasts internationally too. Like you were telling me before that you're looking at what Spotify's putting out on UK to see when Spotify UK is missing out on Black History Month. So like you are on it internationally. So, I mean, that's kind of what I'm about to ask you is like, what are the realized or missed opportunities on the distribution marketing side for people who want to get their podcast to people of color?
One of the things, I think Renee Richardson might be here. She's not. She's located in London. She's one of the people that I'm like, hey, can you tell me what you see? Or like, do you see this? Like, she's one of the people I'll ask if things are going on over there because I can't see what Spotify looks like over there. So I'll ask somebody that lives in a different country, hey, can you look on your page and tell me if you see X thing? And most people are like, sure, let me go and do that. And I'll look into it and just kind of see. I tweet about it if it's not there. I do look into where people are being highlighted and who is being highlighted. I'm big on just scrolling a podcast page and not clicking on anything. And I'm like, if I'm doing that and only seeing white faces, that means you all working there are doing the same and not seeing anything wrong. And to me, that's a problem. So it's easier for me to take a screenshot of that page and say, hey, do you all see this? And no, I tell people all the time, it's not a thing that people really respond to me. The response comes through the app. It's a week later where now you're seeing somebody highlighted that wasn't there. It's you're seeing a list that wasn't there, other podcasts that weren't there that I can tell they probably went on my site and were like, oh, these podcasts are on their first page. We'll just include these things. And I'm like, it works though. So my thing is like, a lot of people are like, how do I get featured? Is it numbers? And I'm like, no, it's the person behind the page. So I know I don't necessarily reach out or email them, but I can tell you who's behind different pages because I pay attention. People will say it at different points if you pay attention to the news and things like that. I'm a detailed person on like at least podcasts. So I'm like, if I'm paying attention to that, that's how, to me, I end up helping. And two, I know how to highlight people more. Like I'm always on Twitter. A big thing is, if you search Twitter, you can always find somebody asking for a podcast. Hey, are there podcasts on X thing? Are there podcasts on X thing? And I'm like, I search those tweets and that tells me what gaps aren't being filled. If you're always asking for podcasts on Black women and all these threads are going viral for podcasts on Black women, that tells me they're not being featured enough places because people are like, I don't know how to find these podcasts. So they have to keep asking Twitter and Facebook and all these other places. And so then I'm gonna do more lists by Black women. I'm gonna do more things of like, if I see somebody asking where are the Latinx podcast, I'm gonna have a Latinx list. If I see one, I'm gonna post it so that you can go link to it and find other people. If you ask me, where, I tell people, like I have the map on my site, a Google map. If you submit to my thing, I've put you in a Google map. So I'm like, podcasts all over the world. If you're like, where are the podcasts in Oklahoma? I don't want you to have to reach out to me. You can go on my site and find that. I tell people, I'm a person and I don't plan on always being around, but I plan on having a resource that if you would like to find the information that you say you're looking for, it is out there and easily for you to find. And that's what I try to be. I'm like, it's there, the people are looking for it. And if you're actually like trying to like talk to those people, like even in the crowd, I feel like I've met so many people and they're like, I didn't know so many women of color podcasts existed, at Werk. And I'm like, that's a problem. Like the fact that you're saying these things, that's part of the gap. And that's not the gap that anybody is helping fill on a bigger level. Like we can get a couple of podcasts, but I'm like, are we really doing anything that people are reaching the podcasts that aren't always, like I say, entertainment, that we're getting into deeper deeper subjects, that we're not only highlighting entertainers that have different podcasts on whatever network it is. So to me, it's like the gap isn't going to be filled if more entertainers get a podcast and people listen to T.I.'s podcast. The gap is going to be filled when people find out that there's wine podcasts and they can listen to those, or therapy for Black girls, or like the other things of like, oh, okay, we do talk about therapy, because I'm so sick of people saying we don't talk about therapy. I'm like, do you Google things? Like, have you Googled this stuff? Because we are out here. Like, you know, it's not like somebody knocking on your door like, hi, I'm Black and I'd like to talk to you about therapy today. But like, if you Google, we are out here trying to do different things. So I'm like, in a different place of, and this will come into a thing with Google Podcasts, a different place of it's gonna be being Googleable, unlike almost bypassing those other places. Like right now, you need people's curated pages, but with Google Podcasts coming in a game, if you are actually paying attention and like you come up in Google, you're paying attention to your episode notes and things like that, you're gonna be able to bypass them on saying I have to be on your curated page because you're paying attention to SEO, and that if somebody Googles you, they can find you without having to go through them other apps, so.
And I just want to highlight, Barry does that that website, that curated website she's talking about, unpaid.
Yes.
So give her a round of applause. Which is going to bring us to one of our last things, which I'm exhausted, please fucking pay me. Because let's be real, all of these women are here because they're doing the work. They're highlighting podcasts made by people of color. They are women of color creating content for their communities and their people. But that's often coming at a personal toll. A lot of gaslighting happens. So I want each and every one of you to just go down and talk about what you do to recharge and what you do to keep yourself accountable to the work, but also keep those around you accountable to the work.
You want me to start?
And I want you to start.
Let's see. I mean, I live in Denver, Colorado, so there is this legal thing that helps me recharge sometimes. I'm very big on taking walks. That's how I listen to podcasts. As I tell people, it's me, my headphones, and I'm walking around listening to podcasts. That's like how I take them in. And that's really my calm down is that like I'll pick one. Sometimes I'll pick an older episode of something I've already listened to and just listen to it again and laugh, or, you know, something I like. A lot of times, if I'm trying something new, it's something I really want to pay attention to, because like other things I can, you know, wander off into mind. But really, I guess I'm just out here. Like, I'm out here. I try to do the things that I'm supposed to do. What really helps me is, like, knowing other people are working. Like I was telling people, I've been a great wing woman at this conference. Like, I want people to know each other. And that, to me, it, like, helps me, because I know even if I'm not doing something, other people are linking up to be able to do things that I wouldn't be able to do. So I'm like, I don't want to be the only person. I tell people, you ain't got to follow me. I'm not even worried about all of that. What I'm worried about is growing in this industry and that we all have a place there. And that's what I'm doing. Like, I want people to link up. I'm always doing that. I'm always like, how can I help you? How can I push you to something else? Who can I introduce you to that I know, you know, that can help you? So my recharging is like taking a moment and then thinking about things I can do that don't necessarily take a lot. I don't think an introduction from me really takes a lot. I'm literally saying, this is what this person does. This is what this person does. You all should do something, you know? So that's it.
If you've never been like connected by Barry, you should. She will do it. She's been doing it this whole conference, and it's just like it's a magical thing. She's like, oh, do you know that? She'll run down your whole thing, and you'd be like, what? Okay, you feel special. She makes you feel warm. What do I do to recharge? Yoga is a big solace for me. Music is a big solace for me. Those are two big things that I do, and what keeps me going is, you know, like I'm here for my people, and I want things to be better for Black people, and I'm gonna do whatever I can wherever I'm at to do that. And so it is that source is not hard for me to replenish.
Yes, I would say it's the same thing. I haven't figured out the whole thing about like yoga and meditation and stuff like that yet. I'll get there. But honestly, the producing Truth Be Told specifically never felt like a job, and it does not feel like a job. And part of recharging is to be able to do this kind of work. So to echo what both of you all are saying, the opportunity to be able to produce something that I really felt was authentic and serving an audience And then to receive that feedback from the audience, it really did feel like therapy. To have people contact us and say, oh my gosh, I feel the same way, and we end up having an hour-long conversation with those people, with a woman, or with all over the country. You know, it just felt so therapeutic, and that is what really keeps me going.
Agreed. When people tell me they found a podcast or like something else, I'm like, thanks. Like, that's what I do this for.
Exactly. Exactly.
So I'm going to do takeaways, but I do want to highlight this quote from the Combahee River Collective, which was a Black radical feminist group from 1977. And I just think this quote kind of encapsulates what's been going on in this panel and the work that we're doing, which is we realize that the only people who care enough about us to work consistently for our liberation are us. Our politics evolve from a healthy love for ourselves, our sisters, and our community, which allows us to continue our struggle and work. And I've got to say, for truth be told, like, I am not a Black woman, but what we said from the beginning is that when we say people of color, we are centering Blackness, and specifically Black women, because it's only when we do that that we can really get at the system of oppression that keeps all women down. So I just want to highlight that. And then say that we have 3 takeaways that I want each and every one of you contributed. And I think just to round it up, I know this has been a conversation that has been about each of our work and the work that we do, but it is also work that you can take away with yourself. So no matter what kind of podcast you're making, you are speaking to someone, and there's a big chance that you're gonna speak to someone and your editor or someone is gonna tell you that you're too narrow or that you can't reach them, and these are our takeaways. I know you can see them, so you can just take one away.
It's not a hard or heavy lift. Don't ask the question if you don't want the answer or aren't willing to change based on your findings.
Listen and make ways to listen and respond.
Meet audience where they are already and distribute accordingly. And when I say that, I don't mean just online. Like, I talk about, you know, where people eat. Like, Starbucks lets you put up signs. Like, you know, people hang out all day there. And a different restaurant you go, when you see they let you leave flyers or different like that. And it's like, are the people you're trying to reach in those places? So maybe that's the places you should be. Maybe they're not on Twitter, but you're looking for local people and you should be in local restaurants and that sort of thing. So looking for there.
We are out of time, actually. We just went to 000. And I think, is there any last statements you want to make? Anybody?
Thank you for taking the time to listen to us.
Thank you.
And if you have any questions, I think like the party is across the street or something, just grab one of us.
And yes, you can submit on podcastandcolor.com if you want to. People always ask me that. It is a submit form on there.
Also, I just want to tell you that Truth Be Told is hiring. We're going into season 2, and we're looking for a senior producer and also an engagement producer. And you'd be working directly with me, and Christina can tell you it's fun, right?
It's a joy. It's a real
fun.
joy.
Yes.
I'm continuing working with her, which is why I'm not longer. I felt like I'm running away
she's
from
now
her.
my producer at Here and Now, which I'm very excited to have her as my producer. Yes.
And if there are any freelance producers who work in the Greenville area, come find me later.
All right. Thank you for letting us do that
Thank
job
you.
for us.
Thank you. Thank you. And I'll just say briefly, too, thank you, of course, for attending the past couple of days with us. Thank you for being part of the 5th Werk It Festival. Also, this job, you know, kind of coming out and doing a little bit of jokiness with a note card is a little clowny. So I just wanted to say, before breaking the whole thing down, there have been so many moments where I found myself with a lump in my throat today. And I feel legitimately like challenged to better my thinking and to find a way to be a better, more responsible public figure. So thank you for conversations like that. Okay, back to clown with a note card. I'm gonna ask you to help me welcome Jennifer Sendro to stage, the designer of this gig.
Hey, everybody. I just want to, before we all go, I wanted to just tell you a little bit about what we did here this week and the people who made it happen. So Werk It 2019, it is our 5th one. 684 human beings attended the daytime programs this year. We had a one-day boot camp for women and non-binary podcasters from the LA area at Second Home on Wednesday, and then these 2 days here at ACE. Several hundred more people joined us last night for a live taping of Here to Slay. Who was there for that? Yes. That was fantastic. We had 57 presenters do 39 sessions. We matched 188 people with mentors, and by we, I mean Yasmin, who will be on stage in a minute. She did it with her own little hands and brain. It's not an algorithm, unfortunately, for Yasmin. One person got a pilot deal with WNYC Studios through our Accelerator. I don't know if Robin's here, but congrats again to her. We had 4 people through a partnership with AIR give one-to-one sound design and engineering advice to a lot of people who signed up for that. And we've been active online. We've been streaming audio and video that'll be on demand later if you want to catch up on what you missed. And you all have been tweeting and Insta-ing and all that good stuff. And apparently we have a potential reach of 7 million this week. That's crazy.
Bing, 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 bing.
That's crazy. All this stuff, yeah, what? Yes, I'm getting to her. She's on this list. She's on this list. It all takes a lot of money, so I do want to thank the sponsors, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the Annenberg Foundation, Luminaries, Spotify, Sprenger, Acast, Himalaya, and the Women's Foundation of California. We also had media partners at the Los Angeles Times and KCRW, and if you came to the party at West Elm, they hosted us there. Angel City Brewing gave us beer, and our boot camp was hosted by Second Home. So those are all the people that gave us money and support. I want to thank all the presenters. I want to thank Dessa. I want to thank everyone on our Werk Advisory Board. If any of you are here, if you want to stand up, take a bow. Taz, Trisha, Martina, Erica, Amy, Gina, Nigeri, who's getting married and is not here, Julia, Kate, Juleka, Rebecca, Kristen, Mukta, Lauren, Chiquita, Bridget, and Jenna. Huzzah to all of you. Everyone at the ACE, Stevie, Nikki, Brendan, Isaac, Ryan, everyone on the ACE team, super fantastic. And everybody back in New York at WNYC Studios. There's only a few of us that are here on the ground making this happen. And if they're here, I want them to pop on out of the wings. Riley McCaskill, who's our sponsorship lead, he's here. Millie Christie Dervaux from our marketing team, Kim Nowacki from social, and Isabeth Mendoza. If you're here, if you want to get on stage, get on here. Doing all our social media. Reaching the 7 millions. Rebecca Kennedy and Molly Hindenburg, who are event angels. You'll see them again at the party. They are amazing. The famous 2 dudes, David McLean on video. He might still be pointing a camera at us right now. And Ricardo Fernandez, who's been running around on stage, fixing all the microphones all the time. Yay, Ricardo. Blakeney Schick, who has been glued to the side of this stage the entire time, hitting all the cues. She was also a producer on Adulting, if you know that show, pretty rad. And then the 2 people who are the beating heart of this all year long, our production coordinator, Yasmin Korsandi, and our senior producer, Denise Bennett. They make all the things happen. So thank all of you again for being a part of this. You're the reason why this exists. We would be talking to ourselves without you. No, seriously, I mean, the community that we create here is really intentional and special and magical, and we hope to keep growing it, so keep in touch. Do subscribe to the Werk It podcast, and you'll get to hear a lot of the great sessions that maybe you didn't get to catch. We will have the video online. We have a newsletter that is not just a bunch of marketing or anything like that. It's not all tickets and sales like that. We do give you content and updates on everything else. Hopefully you signed up for the directory and you can keep in touch with each other that you met here, and let's just keep all these conversations going.
2 words, open bar. Across the street at the Broadway bar, 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. Everybody's invited. Just bring your lanyards and your festival passes. See you there. Thanks again to the entire team, to the audience, and to our hosting. What a gig.